Good morning. I'm John McLeese here at St. Chrysostom's Church for one of our latter sessions in our series on mass incarceration and criminal justice reforming the criminal justice system. We're very blessed to have this morning with us Nate Steinfeld, who is the research director for the Illinois Sentencing Policy Advisory Council, a body that was established years ago by the legislature that, as I understand it, is required by law to evaluate any criminal justice reform proposals, particularly sentencing proposals, so the legislature has some information on which to act rather than just doing it blind. I have given you some documents here, which I'll note, which Nate will talk about in more detail. We've talked about the commission that Governor Rauner established early in his term that gave a report last year with recommendations. Nate will talk about those recommendations that have been adopted in whole or in part and those that are still pending. You will note in particular the evaluation that in the later document that the commission, the council provides of the costs and benefits of each of these provisions. The other documents are related in that the second document is a statement of the ACLU as to top priorities for continuing criminal justice reform in Illinois. A summary of the bill that Nate will talk about that the ACLU has drafted and others have proposed to implement some of the most important of those recommendations. And then Nate's evaluation of each of the provisions of that bill as to its costs and benefits. So I think this will be a very informative session, and thank you, Nate, for joining us.
Thank you so much, John.
You can stand with that.
Sure. So I just have kind of three goals for today. I just want to give some background of SPAC, my organization. We go by the acronym Sentencing Policy Advisory Council, SPAC, and give some background on the Illinois criminal justice system. It's our view, as our agency was statutorily created in 2009, it's our view that in order to fix the system, in order to change the system, you have to understand how the system works and have facts and information on the key levers that can change the mass incarceration, it can change the prison population, it can change probation. So this is the sort of thing that we do for the legislature. We try to provide information on how the system is working, what the levers are that could change those populations, and how that might affect crime. And so we're supposed to look at the criminal justice system as a whole, which is actually quite difficult because of all the different pieces. So I'm going to get into how the criminal justice system works at the state level. And I know that that's probably very rudimentary after you guys have had so many different speakers, but I definitely want to provide some base of information before we get into what the reforms are and what's happening in Springfield. A little background on SPAC. We do not advocate or oppose any legislation, so we don't have an opinion on what anyone should do to change the criminal justice system. Of course, we want the system to be fair and humane and constitutional, so we do keep some of the main goals of the criminal justice system in mind, but we don't, we'll provide information to people, but we won't say you should do this or you shouldn't do that. We have opinions, but we don't say them. And when we do our analysis, as John pointed out, we try to be as impartial as possible of just saying, here are the costs and benefits of different legislation. We try to include as much as possible, and I'm happy to talk about all of that stuff. The ACLU materials that are in the packet, other people have taken our work and tried to make pros and cons for different legislation. We've had prosecutors use our materials and argue that longer sentences are appropriate, and we've had ACLU take our materials and say that shorter sentences are appropriate. So we don't have an opinion on that sort of stuff. So let me just jump right in.
I push it in.
We'll see if that works. Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh my God.
So here's kind of an outline. I'm just going to do the first two here, talking about the Illinois criminal justice system and reform initiatives. And I'm not going to get into any of the other things, although I'm happy to talk about them. Again, I just want to give you an overview of how the Illinois criminal justice system works, and then talk a little bit about different reforms that are out there. I work better in conversation, so please feel free to interrupt and ask questions and poke and prod, because that will make it more interesting for all of us. So we'll jump forward. Do you want, here, I can just do this. No. Nope. John doesn't. Okay. All right, so this is a terrible graphic describing what the Illinois criminal justice system is. But it's really important because this is how complicated the system is. And I'm sorry, it's kind of small, so it's hard to read. But over here you have arrest, like the crime occurs, police will reach out, that's where an arrest will happen. I like to use the examples of television, these are all your cop shows. Then there's a lot of decision points between the arrest and even entering the court. And that's where the local prosecutor decision-making is really important. And I understand that Kim Fox did not speak to you guys, but you did have Paula Wolf, I think, was talking a little bit about some of the decision-making at Cook County. So that's an elected position. We'll come back to that. At this point, you kind of see these little lines here. The person may or may not be in jail. So this is, from a SPAC perspective, this is a resource-intensive process after the arrest decision. Then there's a lot of stuff, procedures that happen in court that takes up a lot of court time and a lot of court effort, and then you'll have defense attorneys and, again, prosecutors involved, as well as a lot of probation pretrial services resources are being used. And let's see, here, after the court case, there are two different outcomes that can happen, probation or prison. So those are two different sentences if someone is found guilty. We focus a lot on the prison piece because that's the most resource-intensive piece. It costs about, when you include pensions and health benefits, prison costs about $42,000 a year, including all of those benefits. Pension is a big piece of it. Whereas probation, being supervised in the community, that is a much less resource-intensive thing, but there's a lot more people in it. It costs about $3,000 per year to supervise someone.
Nate, could you talk about the limitations that were enacted some years ago about the availability of probation and any proposals that are pending to expand the availability of probation rather than having mandatory prison sentences?
Yeah. So this is important because it's very helpful to know which levers you want to control. This is the entry point, so if you want to control this is really important. In the decision between prison and probation, that's another key part where you can control which way people go. So as John said, there are mandatory minimums which say that you can't go towards probation. Instead, you have to go towards prison. That's another very important lever that you might want to control if you're wanting to change the prison population. Illinois does have mandatory minimums, but we call them non-probation eligible. So if something is not eligible for probation, you get convicted of it, you have to go to prison. In other states, you call that a mandatory minimum.
So most probation decisions and contemplation that we hear about are for people who were sentenced prior to the enactment of those rules? That's the main purpose of the probation board now is for the old guys.
Right, so there's a prisoner review board which sits over here. And there's about, I think, 15 people who sit on that. When you're released from prison, under the old system, pre-77, 78, old system, there was an indeterminate sentencing system. So like the judge would say you get 15 to 40 years in prison, and then the parole board, the prisoner review board now, would decide when you're allowed to be released during that time. Now there's determinate sentencing, so the judge will say you get 10 years, and based on how many sentence credits you get an exact period of time from that. Now the prisoner review board kind of rubber stamps what the prison department says and sends out to you. Does that make any sense? Sorry, I feel like I got deep in the weeds already. I'm trying not to get in the weeds. The prisoner review board also deals with mandatory supervised release. This used to be called parole. when someone comes out of prison, they're being supervised not by probation departments, but by state employees, parole agents in the community. And if there are violations in the community, they go back to the prisoner review board, who will then decide whether to send them to prison or not.
Could you please explain, parole boards are state boards or also Cook County or City of Chicago?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I didn't make this very clear. If you're supervised by probation, that's a county function that lives in the judiciary. So all probation officers are judicial agents of the court. And those are county functions. So in Illinois, I think there are 102 counties. I think there are about 95, 96 different probation departments. And each probation department reports up to the chief judge in that county in that judicial circuit. So it's, in Illinois, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because each of these probation departments are lots of sub-agencies. In contrast, once you get to the Department of Corrections and prison, when you're released from that, you're supervised by state agents, state agency, a subset of Department of Corrections, the parole division. Did I say that in a way that makes sense?
No, they're lacking there.
Right, and if you ask parole agents and probation officers if what they do is similar, and they will say no. In fact, in practice, it's a very similar thing that they do. They're supervising the person, they're reviewing their housing situation, they're ensuring that they meet the needs, the requirements of their supervision. It's very similar things. There's different statutory authorization, and they work for county versus state. For us, it's also interesting to think about who pays for these things. At the state level, the parole division is paid through income taxes and corporate taxes. At the county level, all of those county officers say the Cook County Adult Probation Department is paid through property and sales tax at the county level. So these are interesting divisions, and it gets very complicated to think about what the impacts are as you change levers here that I like thinking about. Let's go to the next slide to hopefully make it less complicated. The point of that slide was just to say it's really complicated. Okay, this is a graphic that we made, and I'll just talk over it because it's kind of quiet. Just trying to show, how do you control the prison population? So for this, we kind of created just broad groups. These are not actual specifics, but it kind of shows you 3 different types of people, how long they're going to stay in prison, usually based on the seriousness of the offense. So red, long sentences. So looking at admissions, say there's 100 people coming into prison in a year. Most are the low-level property offenders, drug offenders. Only 6 are going to be serious offenses, armed robbery.
Can you turn off the sound on this?
Maybe.
Yes.
We're losing.
Maybe. The answer is no again.
Okay.
But as you can see, it's important to think about both time and entry. So because the red individuals, people who are incarcerated for long periods of time, stay in prison for so long, you fill up your prisons and jails with those long stays. And even though there's a lot more of these property and drug offenders that cycle in and out of prison so quickly, they're actually a pretty small piece of the prison population. So it kind of depends on what your goals are. If your goal is to reduce the number of people in prison, aiming at these long stay people, which are kind of bad dudes, they're murderers, they're rapists, they're armed robbers, those are the people that are filling up our prisons. Whereas the drug offenders, there's a lot more of them, but they're not the big category in the Illinois prison system. So again, just trying to show graphically why it's important to think about both the length of stay that someone will stay in prison and how many admissions.
In the last slide, the percentages were the total percentage in prison at any one time.
Yeah, and those actually are Illinois numbers in my broad kind of fake groups of green, yellow, and red.
I think our hypothesis is we change the drug policy, maybe we can, the best lever is that incoming
Right.
small offense, or just change the drug laws and
And so-
save a lot of money.
Right, and so in some way, from a pure financial standpoint, and like I love just talking about being a cold-hearted money person, that's not a very effective solution.
It's not.
It won't change. I mean, so this picture is the graphic of who's in prison. If you grab 100 random people from prison, you know, it's going to be only, I forget what the 25% are going to be drug offenders. 75% are more serious offenses that are staying between 3 and 60 years. So, yeah, I think that's about what it was. So, if you wanted to remove people from prison, it's kind of these groups, the more serious offenses. If you wanted to change admissions, which is, on the flip side, a very important goal of, you can affect a lot more people by looking at the drug and low-level offenses.
And the disruption it's caused in their families and communities by incarcerating them.
Right, so like changing possession of a controlled substance of very small amounts, there's a ton of people in that category, but they don't actually end up spending much time in prison. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but there's a lot of them, and
Yeah.
a lot of injustice and a lot of economic cost.
Well, I noted in the report that you gave to the bill, 3355 or whatever, and maybe this is the time you could go into this question, you measure costs and benefits, or so the benefits are the saving money,
Yeah.
and you attempt to estimate costs, including the costs of people actually committing, they're let out, increased number of crimes, and the costs to victims of that.
Right.
And in particular, the ratio of savings to those presumed costs in the case of the drug offenses is extremely large. There's a lot of money saved with very little cost.
Right.
Could you comment on how you determine the costs to victims, and whether you take into account in that calculation somehow the variability of those costs depending on how much effort we put in to helping people stay out of being criminals?
Right. So we have a very simplistic way of trying to incorporate victimization in our calculations. Because the whole reason we have the criminal justice system is to prevent crime and try to make safe communities, right? Like that's the goal, and it's very clear that's why we've decided to build so many prisons and build them up. So we wanted to figure out some way of capturing some dollar value for victimization. And what we found is, or use first the assumption that there's no such thing as crime in prisons. If you locked up everyone in Illinois and put them in prison, there would be no crime because everyone's now locked up. That's not that's not a solution, and you can't do that. That's too expensive, and all the reasons, right? But if you let people out, there is some propensity to commit crime. If all of us were in prison, we wouldn't commit crime. If we are out, there's a possibility some of us might commit crime. So there's always some probability. So we tried to attach dollar values to probability of committing crime. If you let someone out 6 months early and we expect them in their first 6 months in society to commit crime, you've kind of just changed the timing of crime.
That's right.
So we've attached dollar values to those things to try to provide some estimation of the dollar impact of changing penalties. For us, it's been a very important thing to talk with prosecutors and law enforcement officers and say, we're not ignoring the fact that there is a dollar value of taking people off the street. In contrast, though, $42,000 a year, unless that person is really a high propensity to commit crime, you want to balance that out. Is it worth locking up everyone, or is it worth maybe letting them on the street and then having some dollars left over for other things? And that's kind of the purpose that SPAC was created for, and that's kind of what we're trying to do, the balancing move people to thinking in that direction. Is it worth these long sentences for the public safety benefits that we're getting?
Can I ask, do you, like, to me, there's so many other variables that are driving the dysfunction of what we've got going. But one that I've heard that's horrifying is that the law that they're not allowed to live near a school or with a cell phone. And so a guy gets left out 6 months ahead, and his sister's got a cell phone, and so she doesn't want her brother living in the house.
Yeah.
There's basically no place he can live, you know?
Right.
So all he can do is go back to jail because, I mean, that variable those are the kind of things that I wish we could tweak or incorporate in your model of just,
Right.
you know, drivers of mass incarceration.
Right.
You know,
And so for me, when I hear that, like, the part that I'm always interested in is what's the authority for that? And I think for the cell phones, that's the legislature passed this law that says a sex offender cannot live somewhere where there's internet connection. And a cell phone has internet connection, therefore there can't be a smartphone in the house. So like the PRB, like the Prisoner Review Board, like their agency can't do anything. That's a legislative fix that needs to change if you wanted to change that. And legislators, they just want to know what to do. So working with someone who can find that statutory language and to say, well, you cross out these words. Then legislators are interested in proposing a bill and like making that happen. They're always interested in potential solutions. Sex offenders are interesting. I think that there is some interest in reforming sex offender supervision laws and kind of preventing these cycles, like the WBZ story recently on people who keep going back to prison because they can't find adequate housing for longer than their prison sentence. Maybe there is interest now to try to tweak some of those. In the past,
does your group do that kind of tweaking? No, there's not a group that does that.
we don't. We just review proposed legislation once it's proposed by someone.
Don't tweak.
We don't tweak. Yeah. But we review all the tweaks, and there's a lot of them.
I just want to make sure I understand this graphic. So this is if you took up 100 people in prison. This is the breakdown of what
In
that.
Illinois adult prisons,
Okay, I just want to make sure
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
understand.
let's jump forward, John, and I'll go through a few quick slides. Again, just to get kind of the basics. Illinois has felonies and misdemeanor crimes, two different sets of crimes in the Illinois, let's see, what is the criminal code in Illinois? Sorry. And then they're broken down by different felony classes. There are 6 classes from first degree murder to class 4 is the least serious. And the supervision, as we talked about before, the MSR is parole. So that's part of state activities. Whereas probation, if you're sentenced to probation, you are being supervised at the county level. And then the next slide.
Question.
Yep.
Under the incarceration column, when it says 6 to 30 years, for example, does that suggest that the judges have discretion as to whether to sentence somebody to any amount between 6 and 30 years? That is significant judicial discretion that remains.
Right. And in Illinois, most people get the minimum of each class level, which has been interesting to see. That I think that that's some indication that the penalties are often a little bit higher than judges are comfortable, or maybe higher than prosecutors feel like proposing as plea deals, because most people do get like 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 years of incarceration if they're sentenced to prison.
This may be beyond your agency's role, but maybe you have some experience. How common would it be for a plea bargain for a much less than first-degree murder proposed crime to require a 20-year sentence, as I have seen,
Right.
with cooperation of the supposed public defender and the prosecutor.
Right. I mean, we actually just did a review of a bunch of Class X and like non-probationable offenses. People were getting convicted of that and then getting probation sentences. And so there's a lot of instances where all of the actors kind of figure out loopholes in the law to find an equitable outcome.
Or not.
What they view as an equitable outcome. So there's lots of quirks, and what we found in that instance is there was statutory authority in some little hidden over in a different section, and they were doing plea bargains and grabbing that section. So there's less, I didn't find that people were breaking the law and doing illegal things, judges and prosecutors. I didn't find that, but I did find that there's lots of weird exceptions, and our code is super confusing in a way that just the basics, people are going around and finding exceptions all the time.
Thank you.
We just saw this movie, Roman Israel, that just out now that does a great job of showing a man who tried to figure out how to change the system so that like 95% aren't plea bargains.
Yeah.
I mean, they're innocent, but take guilty because it's, otherwise they'll lose and they'll get a worse. I mean, is there any way to affect that?
And so that's procedure, and it's interesting in Cook County, actually, plea bargains are down to about like 70% of cases, which is
Still
kind of crazy in that 30% are going to trial. That's a huge difference from what everyone else is
Huge.
I mean, and there's a lot of, that's not the national instance, like nationally or in the federal courts, it's like 95% plea. It's kind of interesting, like, why is this happening?
Can we get rid of the plea bargain system? How long has that been there?
I see people shaking their heads.
There's an Economist article from a couple of weeks ago there's an Economist article from a couple of weeks ago that talks about that. It arose in Prohibition when there was such an increase in the number of accusations that the court system couldn't keep up, and it has persisted since then.
It's interesting too. I mean, a lot of the legislative changes from the 2000 to 2010, 2015 were made to help plea bargaining. So increase the penalties so that prosecutors can bring down the hammer harder so that people will plead quicker. And mandatory minimums are a great thing, like, take away the option of probation so that if you plead to this, I can maybe propose probation or a shorter sentence. So there's lots of things that happen in this piece and deciding what's a felony and how serious it is, whether probation is possible, that can affect plea bargains.
I've heard that it gives more power to prosecutors and less to judges.
Right.
So, less justice, more
And
compromise.
the flip side, though, from like the 80s to maybe the mid-90s, a lot of our system was trying to move to giving prosecutors more power than judges because we didn't trust the judges. And so there was an
Just
effort of
prosecutors.
judges were imposing sentences that were disparate against people of color. And so the thought was, let's give more power to prosecutors and more consistent decision-making across the system. And that's how we got to where we are today. Let's
Which
go to
is
the
a
next
bad
one.
thing, right? Don't you think? Would you make a judgment? We're going the wrong
I
way?
won't make a judgment, but I will say that the outcomes are not ideal. So misdemeanors, this is actually a huge piece that we haven't, SPAC hasn't dug into. This is even more people are being charged and convicted of these than of felonies. So again, if you wanted to affect more people, misdemeanors are a big thing. On the flip side, there's not a lot of incarceration under this, so it's not a huge resource-intensive thing. But this is how more people are engaged with the criminal justice system, is through the misdemeanor side of things. felonies.
And how does that affect their long-term involvement with the criminal justice system? Have you made any study of that? In terms of
We haven't,
getting
but-
in there,
Yeah.
getting in, and therefore just staying in or being targets for, further involvement.
So people we did a study of the average Joe coming out of prison, like who's the average person coming out of prison? And because of the quick flow of people, the average person coming out is a class 4 drug offender who has something like 18 prior arrests and about, I think it's 7 or 8 prior convictions. So there's a lot of cycling through this system and a lot of just processing and a lot of memories. Let's go to the next one. I'll try to
Could I
speed up.
make one other comment? We saw this movie last night about, it shows how the police, what was it called? Francis McDormand, right, but what? No, but the Francis McDormand in the midtown, the corrupt police pick up people for nothing, and they've got control over them. They've got power over them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new one, but it's a really problematic,
Yeah.
right?
Anyway, here we go.
Let's keep going. These are just some of the overall numbers, again showing the
Is that
high
statewide
frequency.
or Cook County?
This is statewide, 2015. We'll keep going.
So there are a very small number of those arrested for misdemeanors are convicted.
Correct.
But are any of them in jail waiting bond? Cash for failing to meet cash bond. That's the whole cash bond issue.
Correct. That's the
A couple 100,000 of these people are in prison and never will be convicted because they couldn't post cash bail.
Right. And
Actually, I mean bail, not bond.
I think those numbers are changing. For Cook County Jail, I think it's like 80% are pre-trial. And it might even be it used to be a higher percentage. It used to be like 90% of Cook County Jail was pre-trial. And only 10% were people convicted of misdemeanors and sentenced to jail. I just wanted to real quick show like where people are coming. We have a statewide focus. There's a lot of the state that's not Cook County. At the same time, most of the criminal justice system is, the Chicagoland area. And for the most part, it's based on population, where the populations are from. And I also wanted to show just kind of the racial breakdown. Again, it's not proportionate to society or even the counties that are admitting people to prison. So it's one of the things that for me and my research team, it just pops out. Race just pops out as a thing that seems to be a problem. It's hard though when you work with stakeholders. I haven't ever met someone who's like racist, right? Like I haven't met anyone who like clearly has a racial animus. At the same time, the disparities just come through, and I think that there's a lot of room to make big improvements there. A lot of it, there could be a lot of work done just on changing the criminal code to reduce those. For example, unlawful possession of a weapon without a FOID card is something like 80 or 90% black. So it's just not being used for white people. So increasing the penalties on something like possession of a weapon is going to have increased the disparities in the system. Is that one of your goals as legislators, or on the flip side, like there are some public safety benefits? It's a question that we're trying to pose to people and let them decide what the correct answer is. Go to the next one. There's a question in the back.
Well, I don't know whether there's a proper time to ask this question, but what do your calculations have to do with the laboratory effect of the elimination of the death penalty in Illinois, which has not been in effect for the last 5 years? Allowing for 10 years of post-conviction incarceration to account for appeals and the collateral remedies being sought. $420,000, okay, of comparison with expense, given that we've already paid for the deals and, most of them were done for a dollar anyway. It's a lot less than the $2 million that would be effective for a 50-year period of incarceration, given that most murderers are in their 20s, okay? And that's a statistical fact, okay? And I'm wondering whether your remit includes anything that would look at the relative cost of incarceration versus the death penalty without regard to the effects on the society as a whole of whether there is an actuality deterrent effect to the imposition of death penalty, or at least its availability.
Right, so death penalty was repealed in Illinois in 2011. And so I started working at SPAC in 2013. So I haven't had to really look much at the capital cases. And it hasn't been a cost since I've been at SPAC, so I haven't really dug into that. There was a bill last year that proposed bringing back the death penalty in Illinois. I don't think it moved out of committee. But it's kind of an interesting question, and like, there's a lot of theory on the deterrent value of penalties. In criminology, the research that I've looked at points out that it's let's say 100% of murders are reported. The clearance rate of finding the murderer is something like 20 to 30%.
That's Illinois specific.
Right.
Other jurisdictions that are much better.
New York is, I think, 50 or something like that. So if I'm a criminal, the chances that I'm going to get caught are slim. So the prospect of life in prison, I'm discounting that by the probability that I'm going to get caught. And often these are crimes by young people that are not fully aware of all the culpability and actual probabilities. So we don't actually know if they're really making those economic calculations like I'd like them to. And even if they are, they might still be deciding to go out with crime. It's one of the things that, from our financial perspective, front-end spending on police and detectives is probably one of the better uses of money, especially better than back-end prison. This is one of our messages that we drive home for legislators of the two drivers of the prison population, which are admissions and length of stay. Admissions, again, how many people are you letting in the system? You can, similar to how we have crimes that are non-probationable, you could make crimes that are non-prisonable. That would be an option. You can also lower things down from felonies to misdemeanors so that prison is no longer an option. Here I'm using, the terms of art. Prison is a state-run facility where someone is locked up for more than a year, or the sentence is longer than a year. Jail is a county operation that is holding people pre-trial and for anything that's incarceration up to a year.
And I
It's
take,
maybe longer than that, though, at Cook County, right? How many are in Cook County?
Pre-trial. Right now it's around 6,300.
60.
so in this slide, I take it the light-colored wedge. I'm trying. It's hard to see the text. I take it the light. That's okay. The light-colored ones are. Oh yes, okay. The light-colored ones, then you're going to tell us, are the lesser offenses.
Right. And so here are admissions in, I think, 2015. So like there were 230 murder admissions to prison in 2015. Class X, these are those red guys down at the bottom in our moving graphic, are this small sliver, whereas Class 4, the low-level drug and property offenses, and I think like assault, aggravated assault can be a Class 4 as well. So there are violent offenses as well in Class 4.
Isn't there a correlation between the age and the male offense?
Mm-hmm.
But after the male gets to be a certain age, he's much less violent, much less.
Yeah.
Is that something that's filtered into these decisions, that someone, for whatever their sentence is, they're now past that age?
There's a big movement discussing emerging adults is the term right now, of 18 to 25, where there's neurology science that says that brains aren't fully developed, and like thinking about long-term consequences they just don't get it. So there's a lot of emphasis on the 18 to 25 right now. One of the flip sides, though, is that's the majority of crime is people 18 to 25. So if you want to use prison as an incapacitation, you should lock up 18 to 25-year-olds. So in some ways, it's an
Or
aggregate.
think about after they become 30, that whatever it is, maybe they're thrown out.
Or help them out so they don't get in crime in the beginning.
Well,
Right.
if they don't understand the differences, then you've got a problem with any kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. I don't think people know, especially what prosecutors and judges will do if you made age a thing that they should consider in sentencing.
So moving a little bit toward this whole question of what's been proposed and what's been enacted in Illinois, I'm not sure how quickly you'll get there. I note that a lot of emphasis was put on the importance of risk analysis and
Right.
the shift to the relevance of risk analysis, I guess, in sentencing primarily. And those factors, from what you said, perhaps those factors are not currently part of the risk analysis. Is that well defined, what risk analysis issues?
Not yet. There's a lot of work still to be done. In general, in Illinois, when people talk about risk assessment, risk and needs assessment, they're talking about what services to provide once someone has already been sentenced. Or there's a lot of pretrial risk assessment on whether to give someone bond or not. Allow them easy release or cash bonds, those sorts of things.
To close the windows.
Let's go to the next slide real quick too. While the bell's opening. Thanks, John. And so here's the flip side, looking at the population in prison. And again, you see now it's 15% are murdered. So when you start looking at who's in prison, it's a much more serious offender sort of thing. There's been some effort, some bills proposed that allow early release for people who have spent 25 years in prison and are over 50 or over 55 by petitioning the Prisoner Review Board and getting released. Those are often like these guys. People don't spend 25 years in prison generally for drug offenses. And so their cases look terrible. At the same time, you're over 50, you've spent 25 years in prison, you're probably not a high-risk person. Not always, but sometimes. So there's not a large public safety risk, but there is some of our moral feeling of we want to lock these people up forever. And that's something that I actually think that a group like you guys could be pretty helpful in discussing, like, what's the moral purpose here? What's the, locking someone up after 50, after 60? They did bad things 25 years ago. Do we still want to keep them in our prison system? And that's, there's things that I think, and there's financial things, but like, what do we as Illinois residents think?
There have been some discussions of movies about what about the Clockwork Orange solution? Other types of psychotropic or other treatment programs that would take the violence out of the violent offender.
So there's the big thing right now, and I love it because, I have good friends who've gone to cognitive behavioral therapy for sleeping, for anxiety. Cognitive behavioral therapy is something that we all use, and is a training program that helps people think about what are the steps that lead you to certain actions. And it's been shown to reduce recidivism and reduce criminal thinking and criminal behavior quite significantly. And it's also kind of dirt cheap when you think about criminal justice interventions. And there is some of it that's a little creepy. There are definitely farther things that are creepy on trying to refigure people's brains. On the flip side, or we could keep them in prisons that were built in 1860. There's a question.
Well, he is an expert, so.
Yeah.
Well, I got here late, that's why I thought maybe you were, but this is the non-violent drug user. Is that a felony?
Yes.
And how many percentage-wise nationwide would be, I mean, or in Illinois, would that be 30% of people?
Yeah.
And final question, is it, if the law were changed at the federal level, just from felony to misdemeanor, would that take care of the problem in the sense of sentencing these people to long prison terms?
What would your goal be?
Pardon me?
What would your goal be? To reduce the
The
prison
goal would
population?
be to get the people who are drug users out of prison and be where they don't belong.
It would have some effect. It wouldn't have a large effect on the Illinois prison population. In Illinois, it's there are about 30% of admissions are drug offenses. The prison population is what's the percentage? I think it's around like 10 to 15%. So you're talking like a pretty small chunk of.
But there are other resources in your flow chart that are used by
Sending
those
people.
constant flow
Right.
people. You're talking about who goes to jail and stays in jail because of that.
Right.
But all those other boxes, the judges, the
Right.
prosecutors, all that, the detectives, that's all resources that are being focused on those people as opposed to
Right.
catching more murderers and so forth.
Correct.
And another question about your assessment of the savings. Do you take into account at all the benefits or harm to the individual and their families, or that's just totally off? You try to take into account the extra cost to victims, but you don't take into account the benefits to those who are released.
Right. True.
The legislators ever ask you about that?
Yes. And right now we just say we haven't done a lot of work on that. And there's a lot of advocacy organizations that have done a lot of work. John Howard Association, ACLU.
Could you talk a little bit as we conclude about this legislative process and the commission and the documents that we have in front of us?
Yeah, so when Rauner was first elected, he made a speech where he said that he wanted to reduce the prison population 25% by 2025, which is kind of unheard of for a governor to say that. I think he actually is the first that has made such an explicit, concrete goal for prison population control. And it was kind of a big deal. He said that there was a lot of like national interest at that time. He created a commission that was supposed to make recommendations to him to how to achieve that goal. And we were tasked with helping that commission. So that's why I know a lot about that commission. They ended up, instead of just 1 year, it took 2 years, and the recommendations, you can see in the handout with 27 recommendations. They were grouped by things that would reduce admissions, things that would reduce length of stay, things that would reduce recidivism, and just general system improvements. From those were recommendations by a bipartisan commission of important stakeholders, including was it 4 legislators or 8 legislators? And they voted on what the recommendation should be. They tried to keep in mind what could be politically feasible, although there were also emphasis on the chairman of that commission was Roger Heaton, who's now the chief of staff of the governor. So, you know, he's gotten promoted since being on this commission. The recommendations were voted on, and they only took things that won by the majority of the votes. And John asked me this earlier. They didn't record who voted for what. You know, just trying to make it easier for legislators to not like push their buttons. At the same time, all of the recommendations that were made were based off of what the commission had heard for 2 years of public hearings. Lots of very interesting conversations were had during that time. And from those, 4 of the recommendations have been fully enacted. We don't know whether they've been implemented, which I think is a big question. For example, one of the 27 recommendations was everyone who leaves prison should have a state ID. They passed the law saying, of course, everyone who leaves prison should have a state ID. We don't really know if that's happening right now. I don't know that. I've asked, and they're making efforts on it, but I don't know if it's happening. So that's the green thing on this list that they passed the law. It says exactly what the commission says. Is that good?
Now, this legislation that's pending, that we distribute your group's full analysis of the 3355 or whatever.
Correct.
I noted that only relates to certain of what the ACLU regards as key or enactable changes.
Right.
And if all of them were enacted, it still would not reach the governor's goal under your analysis by 2025.
So our analysis before the commission finished was that the 27 recommendations might get maybe an 18 or 19% reduction in the prison population. So by our estimate, it wouldn't achieve the full 25 by 25 goal. But it's hard to say, maybe there would be some overlap, maybe it would change the whole way that the criminal justice system thinks. So there could be additional benefits. There could also be a much smaller impact if people push back and try not to implement certain things. Think about the power of the prosecutor. The prosecutor decides, well, I don't have this option, but now I'm going to try a different avenue. There's a lot of ability for prosecutors to get the outcome that they want. So it kind of depends how much the system is ready to actually achieve that goal. And talking a little bit about what you can do, this is outside my wheelhouse, but elections matter. All of the different players in that complicated flowchart of the criminal justice system, the sheriff, the judges matter a ton. Prosecutors are the incredibly important gatekeeper. One of the recommendations that hasn't passed but was proposed in 3355 was increasing the felony threshold. So how much money can you steal before you end up in prison versus probation or misdemeanor. State's Attorney Fox kind of single-handedly issued a memo saying that none of her prosecutors were supposed to prosecute anything below $1,000 as a felony, and just made it by decree. And that works because she can tell her prosecutors what to do. She's elected. She feels like she has a mandate to do that. Her prosecutors will not get promoted and get their job security if they don't follow her decree. And that just happened. So there's a lot of power. At the same time, the prison population has fallen about 12 or 13% since January 2015. The big cause of that decline is simply that the police stopped arresting drug offenders in Chicago. Not completely, but for the most part. Arrests for drug offenses in Chicago are down 60%, 70%, which is unheard of.
Why did that happen?
If you have the answer, I would love to hear it. We don't quite know. There was no policy shift. It was about the same time that Laquan McDonald happened, and it was about the same time as the Ferguson stuff was happening.
We're paying attention to them, maybe keeping the spotlight on them.
And so that's having a huge effect, a ripple effect throughout the system of there's just fewer admissions into the whole system.
So when will this 3355 be considered by the legislature?
So legislative session is January through May, and it starts over with it's the same legislature, it's the 100th General Assembly as last year. I don't think there's any new people, there's a few replacements. I could be wrong on that. But starting in January, they'll be proposing legislation. I imagine that the ACLU will have some legislative person sponsor that bill or something similar to it.
What bill?
The bill, House Bill 3355, the back few pages are our SPAC analysis of that bill. That bill is close to the recommendations, a few of the recommendations, but it's not exactly replicating. And again, whoever sponsored the bill made some political determinations that parts of it were pushing the envelope too much. So even from the recommendations, there's a few pieces that are scaled back.
Is this the one that our?
Sir, excuse me.
Yeah.
Truth in sentencing came about in like the late 90s, I believe you said.
Yeah.
Is that 85%, 90% you do that time? Is that the metric against which you're sentenced? Is it 80 or is it the entire?
Right, okay, so truth in sentencing is the idea that if you get sentenced to 10 years, you spend 10 years,
Okay.
is the concept. In reality, at the federal system, it's 85% of your sentence you have to serve.
There are two populations in Illinois that would factor into the $42,000 incarceration yearly cost. One would be the population that was sentenced after truth in sentencing, and the other would be the population that was sentenced before truth in sentencing when you got day for day. One of the consequences of parole, or one of the benefits of parole, is it controls population in the joint.
Mm-hmm.
And has there been an increase in assaults on prison guards, other crimes that are done to other inmates since the truth in sentencing rule has been imposed so that nobody gets the benefit of proper behavior while incarcerated?
Anecdotally, I've heard that's 100% true. I don't know if I've seen any studies that have controlling for all factors. I haven't seen any of those. But that's a huge reason that there's a push to repeal truth in sentencing or scale it back. In Illinois, there are 3 different levels of truth in sentencing. If you commit murder, you have to serve 100% of your time. So anyone who's in first-degree murder, you get sentenced to 40 years, you spend 40 years. There's no option for any good time credit. There's no option for, I took an education class, no credit for any of that. And when truth in sentencing came about because the feds offered a bunch of money for building prisons if you passed truth in sentencing. So people passed truth in sentencing in order to get some money that didn't even pay enough for the prison to, there was some analysis done at the time that said it wasn't worth it, and we still followed through. And other states, when they enacted truth in sentencing, so it used to be you'd get sentenced to 40 years for murder and you'd spend 20 if you behaved in prison, which most people caught on and would behave in prison well enough to get out in 20. When truth in sentencing happened, as soon as that came into effect, people are now spending 40 years. That happened in 1999. We're still getting to the point where people are how do I say this? We haven't reached the full impact of truth in sentencing because people would have been locked up for 20 years and they're still locked up. Post 2019, we'll start seeing an increase in the prison population solely because of the truth in sentencing for the murder population. And another interesting tidbit I'll just throw out there on truth in sentencing: if you are in a car of people that shoot someone and kill someone, everyone in that whole car can be held accountable for that murder. So everyone in that car, through the accountability theory that's Illinois law, everyone can be convicted of first-degree murder in that car. So someone who was just driving, a friend who was sitting in the front seat didn't know what was happening, put it in air quotes because it's hard to know what people knew, and it is a difficult thing to understand. Every single one of those people in the car can be locked up for 40 years. That's another, I think this group thinking about what's the moral thing to do, where do we want our penalties? These are very real things that deserve discussion and deserve thinking about. I can show you lots of numbers on the costs and benefits of things, and we can weigh it out, but there is something that's just a moral what is the appropriate thing to do here, and that needs to be discussed. There was a question.
Usually there are three categories of truth in sentencing, so
Oh, yeah, sorry, bring me back.
what are the other two?
There's an 85% for serious drug offenses, and DUIs and some violent offenses. So armed robbery is a truth in sentencing. A lot of sex offenses are truth in sentencing. And then there's a 75% that's a very small category of people for some drug offenses that they wanted to crack down on, but not too hard. So they created a subcategory of 75%. There's been some proposals to change those, and they haven't really done much. So I can get into more details on the ways that they're poking around on reforming those things, but the way that all works is how many credits for months in prison do you get? If you are day-for-day credits, you get 15 credits. And then they scale that back. Murderers get 0 credits for a month in prison. And so it's all worded weird, it's complicated. And so there's been a lot of legislative proposals that I think people are well-intentioned, but not using legal analysis on like how to actually achieve the goals that they're trying to do. And that's tricky. And there's a lot, truth in sentencing sounds great. There's a lot of feeling of you get sentenced to 10 years, you should spend 10 years. The problem is judges always sentence murderers for 40 years, knowing that the person spends 20. And they're not going to change just because truth in sentencing, like some credits in prison have changed. They don't care. Well, they do care. And I've heard judges say that they would like the laws to be ratcheted back a little bit.
Do they ever survey judges? I once met a judge who said, my life is terrible. I have to, by federal law, if this person drove over the state line with some drugs she didn't even know were in the back of her car, she has to be put in jail for, it's a felony. And has there ever been a survey where the judges say, change this? This is really, I know I'm unjust, but I can't help it. The law is making me do it. And, that's what really has to be changed. This outside in it's really police state stuff that has got unintended negative consequences.
There's a poll in here, or maybe in the slideshow that ACLU did on just Illinois voters. There was another poll done by Alliance for Safety and Justice last year, and they presented to the commission surveying victims of violent crime, victims of crime in general, and their opinions of the criminal justice system. And it's not at all what you think. Like, victims don't want everyone to just go to prison forever. Victims don't want harsh penalties that are disproportionate to what the offense is. Victims want people to be rehabilitated and services in the community and people to get back on their feet. So there are some really interesting findings there. There haven't been any surveys of judges, and in my experience, the judicial branch in Illinois tries really hard to stay outside of politics, even though they're elected. And so they don't, at least outwardly, they don't get involved at all in legislative decisions on what penalties.
They don't comment. There's so little, to me, there's this silencing, this gagging of the truth. Because they're like, we can't comment,
I mean, that would be an interesting.
So how do you know? Yeah.
Like, I don't know what the Chicago Bar Association and other bar associations will rank judges. It would be interesting to have some group say, well, before we retain judges or elect judges, we want to know their opinions on criminal justice. A newly elected judge will not go into the criminal division. They often end up in traffic or kind of low-level misdemeanors or municipal stuff, and then they graduate as they get more experience to criminal court. This is Cook County, and so it would be interesting.
Yeah, we don't even know anything about them. I remember with the judges, you look for. I saw one thing say, don't vote for this lady, and I couldn't remember which one she was. Yeah. Right, how do you know these judges? It's such a,
They're the hardest to research during elections.
Yeah.
They're really, because they don't have websites and
And
they
they're
don't
200.
make statements. I mean, I research everybody a lot, but they're so difficult.
I mean, so this is not SPAC's opinion, but my opinion, I would love if we could get more just raw data on judges. And, you know, there would be civic groups that would, you know, figure out ways to, like, just generally, like, percentage overturned, the percentage of people that are immediate to just sentenced to prison versus not, you know.
Just their general internet presence is low.
Right. Well, and so this is, you
it's
know,
almost like it's been.
when you post my statements of that, judges will freak out because, like, that's, you know, that sort of accountability is what they're worried about. Like, they don't, and to some extent, each case, like, they're supposed to be determining that on an individual basis. And they think that they're doing a good job of just thinking on that individual basis. And from all my interactions, like, as I said, like, race jumps out, but, like, the judges I've met, like, I would be shocked if any of them have, like, racial bias. At the same time, you look at the system as a whole.
Thank you, Nate. You've gone well beyond the time, and we appreciate your indulgence and the information and your work in bringing facts to bear on all of these issues. Thank you.